Welcome to the first DSS event of the year, and it is with enormous pleasure that we have with us Kareem Cook. You are incredibly fortunate to be able to hear from Kareem. He is a master entrepreneur. He is a dancer extraordinaire, a choreographer. I'm running out of these words here, but as you'll learn, he has an incredible background, a background that one would think, how could it lead to where he is today? And yet here he is, where he's taken every piece of his life and put it together in a way that has been just magnificent. So, Kareem, welcome back home.
Thank you for having me back home.
So Kareem is a double Dookie. He's Duke undergrad, class of '94, with his good friend Grant Hill. I got to see some national championships there, and then came back for his very important degree from Fuqua. But I want to go back in time. Actually, I want to connect it to something that just happened, which is you were given an honor from Prep for Prep.
Yep.
The first alumni from that program to receive their Person of the Year award.
Yeah.
Just this past summer, right?
Right.
And you're actually on the board of trustees of Prep for Prep as well.
Yep.
But Prep for Prep changed your life many, many years ago.
Yeah.
Where you were in the Bronx. Took a test, identified as someone who could be given an opportunity in a different kind of schooling setting. And so you're living in the Bronx and you're attending a private school in Manhattan full of rich white people.
That sums it up.
So first of all, just very quickly, tell us what Prep for Prep is. Since you're on the trustees, you want to give them a shout out. But then my question is, what was it like? What were the challenges of having, you said during that time you had 1 foot in each place.
Yeah.
What were the challenges of having 1 foot in each place? And what was it that you were able to bring forward from that experience of being in those two different environments that's been helpful today?
Yeah. Again, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. So Prep for Prep is a nonprofit in New York City that identifies very smart kids at the age of 10. They test back then they tested about 1,000 or 1,200 students, and they select about 70. And what happens is, in fifth grade summer, you attend Prep for Prep for 10 hours a day, and then you go back to your public school in 6th grade. But Wednesday evenings, Saturday all day long, you're taking these courses and you're taking 8th grade level work in 5th grade. That following summer, you go back, and then in 7th grade, you matriculate, you receive a scholarship to the elite private schools in New York City. And so it's an extremely successful program, and some of the most amazing human beings have come through that program and have had opportunities. It's life-changing. And for me, I identify it as, it was that moment in my life where I was on one path and I was plucked up, picked and put on another path, and it's made all the difference in my life. So I give it all the credit, and it's been an honor to be selected to be on the board. I just joined in January. So the challenges, I would say, of going to that private school was, I'm from the Bronx, New York, and I was 100% Bronx, New York when I got to the private school, and it was about 95% white, predominantly Jewish. Most of the kids had money. We were pretty much poor, and so that was for me. That was a new situation. One, to deal with, my school that I grew up with was predominantly African American, Hispanic, and some white, like poor Italians. But to go to an environment where people had money, And I was nervous about it, but the first day of school, I ended up having an incident, and I won't go into the Towerview type situation where I'll just say I beat up the school bully the first day of school. I just got picked. And it made me very, very popular. So it set the stage for my, my existence. I got home that day, and my mom was like, well, how was your first day of school? I said, I have good news and bad news, Mom. I got into a fight, but everyone loves me. And, you know, but the kids there were very, very welcoming. And the parents now, and you know, it was at that time that I realized the difference between how, you know, the kids were raised in the neighborhood that I was from and these kids, you know, how they were just set up for success in a way that we weren't. Because I didn't know any black kids that had grown up with their father in the house until I went to college. But at Calhoun, you know, and the parents loved me. They would fight for who gets to have me come over for the weekend. And I was always amazed at what would be discussed around the dinner table. You know, these parents were lawyers and bankers, and they would talk about, you know, what they were doing. And we just didn't have that, you know. I would have already eaten before my mom came home from working, you know, 2 jobs. And so, you know, that was striking to me, and it was something that I took into as I became an adult, and now I have a daughter. I think about it, and I talk to her about what I do. But keeping that one foot in, my mom was a president of the NAACP in my section of the Bronx, so I knew who I was as a black person. But I was able to remain who I was, but also add this on to me. And so I didn't have to change. I didn't feel like I had to assimilate in order to fit in. The school accepted me for who I was. You know, those kids did as well. And then I would take those kids to the Bronx and traumatize them every once in a while. My mom would say, hey, get some of your friends to come be in my play at the NAACP in the Bronx. And, you know, a couple of them did. And then my friends from the neighborhood would walk them to the train at the end. You know, they'd be looking around like, but it was a great experience, and it set me up for life because it made me open-minded, you know. And I wouldn't say that I wasn't open-minded, but it has taught me that in any environment, I could definitely win. I could be accepted. I could be myself. I didn't have to be anyone else, and I could still rise to the top. And so it was a great experience that set me up for life.
So from this school, you went on to Duke.
Yeah.
And survived that experience as an undergrad.
Did.
Went on to work for an insurance company after graduating. Yeah. And tell me, why did you quit that job?
Oh man, so I worked at an insurance company, and I won't mention the name because it's not a good story. I don't want to get sued. There are cameras in here. And so I was working for an insurance company, and I decided that I wanted to go back to Fuqua, and I wanted to get some business experience. And this company sold not only insurance, but they also sold mutual funds, annuities, you know, financial instruments. And I decided I wanted to learn about that, and so I took the gig. But I didn't realize what it really meant to be 100%, you know, commission. So it's just, you only eat what you kill. But I was good, and so I quickly was making about $1,000 per week, doing well. And then one day I go out with my boss, and I meet with this woman and her kids, and I realize that she can't afford the insurance. All right, I'm like, all right, well. And they had a vehicle for people like her. It was called term insurance, where they would start out maybe $25 a week, but it eventually increased. And I could see that by the time that $25 became $100, she wouldn't be able to afford to have it anymore, and there'll be a waste. So I said, you know what? I'm going to stay in touch with you, and I'll revisit you later. My boss was so angry at that. We had an argument in the car, and I said, you know what? I'm not going to sell the insurance. And then they taught us these different methods on how to sort of manipulate different people depending on who they were. And I just didn't feel good, and my spirit didn't really jive with it. And I said, you know, I'm going to sell mutual funds and annuities and all these other things that I don't have to sell as you need, but you might want, and you could make some money. And the commissions for those were so small that I couldn't survive. So my check went from like $1,000 to $500 to $30, and I was making like $15 a week. But I was so, you know, my ego wouldn't allow me to just quit, that I just kept doing it. And I was working like 18 hours a day. And so finally, and by the way, I was paying for my rent with my credit card. So finally, I go in the office one day and I see my marketing assistant, and she looks even more down than I was. And I said, hey, you okay? And she's like, I'm okay. And I said, look, let me take you to lunch, because let's figure out what's going on here. And she goes, no, thank you. Lunchtime comes, I ask her again. I said, look, you sure? 'Cause you see this credit card, I'm about to pay for everything on this, and when it's maxed out, I'm not paying these people back. And she was like, no, but I appreciate it. The following week, we have a company-wide meeting. It's a very stressful job to be 100% commission, so they like to have their finger on the pulse and see how people are doing. And she stands up at this meeting and she goes, you know what? I want to say that everyone here, you guys are all hypocrites, and I want to thank one person, and that's Kareem Cook, because the day that I found out that I have terminal cancer in stage 4, he's the only one that noticed. So Kareem, thank you very much, but the rest of you guys. And I just broke down and got up, went to my desk, packed my stuff. It was a Friday evening, and I went to my boss's office and I said, hey, it's no need for 2-week notice, right? And he's like, nope, shook hands, and I was gone. And so that's how that ended. And yeah, I could tell you what happened next. It's probably gonna be the craziest thing you're gonna hear today and this year. But that was Friday. I go to sleep and I slept like 16 hours. I was exhausted both nights, Saturday, Sunday. And I wake up Sunday and I get a call from Debbie Allen. And I don't know if you guys might be too young to know who she is, but there was a show in the 80s called Fame. And she was a producer and she was the star of the show. And eventually she went on to produce like Scandal and How to Get Away with Murder and Amistad. And she's a Hall of Fame type person in Hollywood, has the premier dance academy. But she calls me up and she goes, hey, my brother who went to Fuqua says that, that you're a great dancer and you can step. And I was in my fraternity in undergrad. We would win all the shows and we were well known. He's a fraternity brother. And she goes, I'm working on something in New York. You think you could come up? And I was living in DC. You think you could come up to New York tomorrow? And I'm like, yeah. I said, I quit my job 2 days ago. I can come up there tomorrow. So I go to Sony Studios in Manhattan. I meet her and she goes, all right, let's see what you can do. Show what I can do. She's like, all right, well, cool. We can't wait to show Michael when he comes in. And I'm like, Michael? She's like, yeah, this is for a Michael Jackson concert. I didn't tell you I'm the head choreographer for this Michael Jackson concert. And I was like, no, you didn't say that. So a couple hours later, he comes in with the smooth criminal hat and the mask that we all thought was funny back then, that we all were wearing 2 years ago. And he goes, all right, let's see what you can do. So I'm prepared, because this is the other thing that's kind of crazy. Since I was about 5 or 6 years old, I knew 2 things would happen in life. I knew that I would meet Michael Jackson and we would be friends. And I also knew I'd be on Wheel of Fortune. And so when these 2 things happened in my life, I had like a supernatural calmness about me, because I'd been seeing these moments my entire life. So he comes in, I do my thing, and he's like, wow, you're like Fred Astaire, you're like Gene Kelly. I'm a Kappa, if you know what that means. I do cane tricks and stuff. And I was being extra, because I knew who it was. He was like, wow, you think you can choreograph a routine to my show, my song Bad, doing that stuff you were doing? I said, yeah. And so Debbie's like, all right, baby, you're a choreographer, now go get your stuff. And so anyway, for the next 2 months, I ended up working with Michael Jackson, and we became friends. Debbie Allen and I became friends.
So this is an interesting moment for you. You're a big believer in providence.
Providence, yeah.
But you were going to go to business school. You put that off for a couple of years and pursued. You could have become a world famous choreographer, dancer. Why didn't you go down that path?
Oh man, so Sharon's here. Sharon Thompson was my first year here. It was her first year here, so we're connected that way. And then Liz was the director of missions then. So I got into Fuqua while I was doing this Michael Jackson stuff. And I was like, do I want to go to Fuqua? And, we mutually agreed that maybe they'll accept me, but I'll defer for 2 years. I was running around, trying to be Michael Jackson Jr. And so that didn't work out. The show was canceled the day before because he fainted, but we stayed in contact. But Debbie Allen and I stayed in contact, more importantly. And she ended up commissioning a show at the Kennedy Center the next year, and she calls me up. She's like, you know that stuff we were doing with Michael Jackson? I want to continue to do this stuff, and maybe we can incorporate it in the play that I'm doing. And a play starred her, a famous singer by the name of James Ingram, rest in peace, passed a few years ago, Vanessa Bell Calloway. And she goes, why don't you understudy the lead role? The guy gets sick. I understudy the lead role. He gets sick. I end up doing the play, a couple shows, right? And then I decided, well, maybe, Fuqua doesn't know this, but then I said, well, maybe Fuqua isn't where I should go. So I applied to the Peter Stark producing program at USC, which is the premier producing company, right? A producing program. And I had to make the decision. Do I want to go be this producer in Hollywood, or do I want to, and just learn business for the filming? Do I want to learn business on a general level? And I decided Fuqua, and they gave me a scholarship, so I was like, that's easy. So I ended up coming back to Fuqua. So that's how I made that decision.
Okay. So you believe in providence, that the things happen, that there's some divine purpose there, and things work out. But you also believe that there are moments in your life, and you have to be ready to seize those moments. Another expression that describes this is that luck favors the well-prepared, right? Yeah. That when those moments hit, you got to seize those moments. So what is it about you? You've led a life with so many of these moments where things could have gone in a really bad direction, and yet you've taken those moments and you've gone in a very positive direction. What has given you the fearlessness to be able to seize those moments and turn them into positive moments?
An irrational, illogical belief in myself. I just again, Dean Boulding keeps referencing providence, which is my favorite word. I heard it in a Matrix movie where, I'm a big Matrix fan, and there was a scene where the world was about to be destroyed, and and everybody's scared. If you're familiar with the movie, I'm not going. Some people who hate science fiction, this is going to be the worst thing you're going to hear right now. But there's a scene where Morpheus calms everyone down. There's Lawrence Fishburne's character, and he goes, he said, tonight is a very important night for all of us. He said, when I see three captains, three ships, and three purposes, I don't see luck. I don't believe in luck. I see providence. I see purpose. Tonight will reveal the meaning. Tonight's going to reveal the meaning for the purpose in all of our lives. And I'm paraphrasing. And I said, wow, that word providence sounds really powerful. I looked it up, and it means divine path set before you by God. And I immediately printed it out and took a picture of my business partner and I hung up the definition along with a picture in our office. And I really believe that, there's an inner voice that just tells you when you're on the right path. And some of us listen to it and some of us don't. But you prepare yourself so that when you hear that voice, you can just go forward. And I've just chosen to go forward with a certain fearlessness. I'm an entrepreneur, and you have to believe in things that are unseen. You have to believe in that voice because by definition, entrepreneur is trying to chart a path that hasn't been charted before. There's no blueprint to it. There may be a blueprint to being prepared to be an entrepreneur, but actually succeeding in entrepreneur, you're going to be charting your own way, and you have to have an almost irrational belief in yourself that no matter what comes, whatever the challenge is this morning when I wake up, I'm going to be able to beat that challenge. And so I've always kind of felt that way about things. And so when I'm faced with obstacles, I always try to think about I'm only being faced with this obstacle because it's here for me to overcome. And so that's where I truly believe. And so I've had those moments in my life. I've had a lot of those moments in my life. And so sometimes when doors open, I just walk through because I just know it's meant for me. And I'll give you an example of that. So Debbie Allen, who I talked about earlier, premier choreographer. When I was at Fuqua, my first year, we had our Black MBA conference. It was in Anaheim, and I went and saw her while I was there. And this was 3 years after meeting her, 6 years after meeting her. And in her living room, she goes, you know, I feel like my life is leading up to opening up a dance academy like I did in the show Fame, but I don't know how to write a business plan. And I was focusing on entrepreneurship here, and my business partner was focusing on entrepreneurship at Wharton. And we looked at each other, and we were like, okay, we got to skip these parties if we offer up what we're thinking about. And we said, you know what, we could write you a business plan. So we go back to the hotel, and at the end of 2 days, we give her a 30-page business plan full of financials and everything. It's just do this, and you'll have a successful business dance academy. And she goes and she raises money from Steven Spielberg, Eddie Murphy, Denzel Washington, all these different celebrities that she's friends with. And she opens up the Debbie Allen Dance Academy, which becomes the premier dance academy in really the country. Fast forward a few years later, and I'm moving out to LA. This is after graduated now from Fuqua. And I'm trying to be an entrepreneur, and we're moving, my business partner and I are moving to LA, and she's calling us up. I need another version of the plan, and she never paid us for the first one. But we're stopping at, you know, Kinko's in Texas and New Mexico and Nevada, and we show up in LA with a U-Haul, by the way, because we were moving here. And we walk into our office and we're salty about it, and we're like, here's your business plan, Debbie. You know, basically have a nice life. She goes, you know what, boys, I never really paid you guys for this, but here's the dance academy that you helped me open. And I know you guys are entrepreneurs or something, but there's a whole office in the back that you can have for your own business, you know, whatever it is you want to do. And the blessing was there were 2 computers, 2 desks, 2 phone lines, you know, Wi-Fi. She had a machine to bind, you know, business plans. And why would that be in a dance academy? And that was the biggest blessing of all, because we had an office. And I actually, true entrepreneur, I ended up living in the office for a year. Like, I literally lived in that office. And so since I was there, I figured I might as well take dance classes, and took salsa, became a professional salsa dancer on the side, but that's a different story. But the whole point is, it was the way that worked out. And within 2 weeks, and the story goes on forever, but we ended up starting a vending machine company that we wrote the business plan within 2 weeks. We started a plan within a month. We cold called the president of the YMCA's, and we said, you know, just walked in his office and told him, you got soda machines in your lobby trying to kill these kids, what's up with that? You know, walked out there with 26 YMCA's. Within a year, we had 7 schools. And 2 years, and within 14 months, we lobbied the school board and got the law changed, banning junk food in the schools. And within 2 years, we had every single public high school, middle school in Los Angeles. And that's 2 years after moving to LA, and all while sleeping on a futon in the office. So that's Providence.
Okay, so coming out of business school, you could have gone the corporate route, but you were a self-described entrepreneur. How did you come to that realization that that was who you were? Because so much of success is having that self-awareness.
So the moment someone decides that they're going to be an entrepreneur, I think I've heard 1,000 different stories of how they come to that moment. And mine is probably going to be the craziest thing, the reason that you've heard. But in between my first and second year at Fuqua, my internship was at Disney World as a brand manager for African American and Hispanic markets. It was a really fun job, and I really enjoyed it. However, when I first received my letter of acceptance, they had a book called The Disney Look. And in that book, they had pictures of what you could and couldn't look like. And on the page of what you couldn't look like was basically a picture of me, right? And what I mean is, they didn't allow facial hair at Disney, right? And I said, all right, you know, we'll deal with it for a summer. I'm 27, I know what I want to look like, but you know, we'll try it out. And I hated it, right? Because there was something about my spirit. It was just really that voice saying, this is not for you. But so I, you know, rule breaker extraordinaire, and you know, just chart my own path. I would shave Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Thursday I wake up and I wouldn't shave. You know, Friday I wouldn't shave, and then Saturday I wake up and shape up my goatee, right? Sunday it would look kind of the way I liked it to look, and the Sunday I'd have to cut it off and start that old cycle again. And it was in that moment where I just said to myself, you know what? I can't. I just don't want to work for someone and be beholden to someone else's rules. And you know, I need to chart my own path and be able to make my own rules and get to the same point, but the way I want to do it. You know, and win or fail, this is what I feel like I need to do for myself. And I knew that early on.
So you become a successful entrepreneur. You already mentioned the vending machine business, and then on to your current venture, not to mention your investment firm, which you founded. Yep. So as I listen to you talk about the things that you've done with these startups, you always seem to know how to get to the right person at the right time to fix these problems that you run into. And it seems to be a mixture of, you're going to walk into the office of someone you've never met before with, I'm going to call on someone who I met 20 years ago. So talk to us about the networks that you've established and the combination of drawing on the networks you've created and your willingness to go and start something brand new with a cold call.
Yeah. And so I would say that the most important thing attribute that I've gotten really good at is networking. And for me, it's a natural thing. And I know that you can work on this skill set. But for me, networking is the word that I'm using to describe this to you so that you understand what I'm saying. But for me, it's just really the way I am. You know, I like to meet people. I like to know people. I'm an extrovert, and so I'm very engaging, and I find value in just about anyone I've ever met. You know, I think there's something special about just about everyone. And so I'm really interested in people, you know, on a genuine level. And I didn't realize that would serve me in a positive way until I needed to network. And so throughout my years, I just, every iteration of myself, every environment I've been in, I take those people with me, right? I grew up in the Bronx. You know, I just threw a 50th birthday party in New York at the Jay-Z's 40/40 Club, right? And I had about 450 people there. And at one point I got on the mic and I said, if I know you from Parkchester, where I grew up, you know, from kindergarten to 12th grade, you know, who are you here? And then, you know, a lot of people were like, I said, all right, if I know you from Calhoun, my high school, middle school, you know, a lot of people were there. If I know you from Duke, if I know you from LA, you know, if I know you from my fraternity. And all these people are from different eras of my life that I've brought along. And so networking is key. And part of networking is also maintaining a bridge, which means staying in contact with people. But it's been something that was natural for me, but I think it's something that's critical for all of us. You know, if it's not natural for you, it's something you should work on, because especially if you go to a place like Fuqua, or if you're part of the Duke community, because it's just been invaluable for me. So all of my investors, when I raised what was called a search fund, and which is raising some money to go look for a company. And many of those people, as you alluded to, were cold calls, you know, but all of them were like trustee level people that I somehow was able to meet, somehow pitched what I was trying to do, and gained an audience with, and eventually convinced that they should invest with me. And one of the most interesting pieces of that journey was I got a hold of the board of visitors, the list of board of visitors, as well as the trustee board. And what I ended up, my business partner went to Duke undergrad, but Wharton Business School. We ended up calling every single person who was a trustee or on the board of visitors, and found out when those board of visitors and trustee meetings were, and we just showed up. And so at Fuqua, at the board of visitors meeting, every time they had a break, I had a meeting, right? And I was like, hey, you know, I'm a Fuqua student, I'm trying to meet blah, 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 and are you gonna be in Durham? And they're like, I'm gonna be there too. And so, you know, I ended up raising all the money I needed. I raised, you know, $1 million for the search fund. And then when it was time to found a company, we bought a company, relied on those same people and even more. And that was all about meeting people, you know, and over the years, because you raise a search fund, but it might take you a few years to buy a company, but you know, all that is establishing that relationship. And so it's been an invaluable tool for me, and I definitely recommend, if I could leave you with one word of advice, is to network with the people who are in, I mean, you spend 2 years here with some of the most amazing people that you will ever meet. And most of the people in this room will go on to do amazing things. And, you can look left and right, but I'm telling you, you will not imagine what your classmates and the people a year ahead of you and behind you will be doing in the next 20 years. And my classmates are doing amazing things. They're some of the most successful people in the world. And I can call on them to just help me or make an introduction, And so these are the things you need to do. Figure out how to get into that Duke directory when you graduate, when you're in a new city, because it's served me. And I could tell the Costco story, but if you want. But one of the things we did, I'm in Costco right now, which is considered the holy grail of distribution. And one of the things I do is whenever I have a meeting, whenever I want to meet someone in a company, find a Duke directory or a Wharton directory, because we have that, and I find the highest ranking person in that company, and we'll sit down and meet with that person. Found out the highest ranking person, Wharton person, with the CFO of Costco. And so we took a long time to write the perfect email that we sent to him, which he opened, and we could see we were sitting there looking. We got the read receipt. You just read it. And emailed us back within 10 minutes, inviting us to his house. And so we go the next day. He's like, I want to support you guys. I can't get you in Costco, but I'll be as helpful as I can be. And he offered to, right then and there, maybe I can invest $50,000 with you guys. And we're like, no, thank you, because that means we'll never be able to get into Costco. Over the next 4 years, we would meet with him and go up to Costco and act like we had meetings, but we were just maintaining the bridge. We were just figuring out a reason to be in his presence and have him be reminded of us. And finally we said, look, we have this one thing we want you to do. We want to have a meeting with the CEO of Costco. Can you set that up? And he said, I'd be happy to. And we ended up having a meeting with the CEO of Costco, and that was the meeting that allowed us to get into Costco. So.
With your ability to network, you could have been in all kinds of different spaces. In your connection to the music industry, to Hollywood, and so on, and yet your ventures have always focused on wellness. Why is that?
It's something that my business partner Claude Tellis and I talked about when we were in college. We both come from large families, and at a certain age, everyone seems to pass away from a diet-related illness, right? Diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, these kind of things. And we had discussed it back then, but when we became business partners, we were like, man, let's figure out if we could do something about this problem. And that's why we came up with the Healthy Vending Machine company. And like I said, we were successful in that within just 2 years. And then we said we should buy a company that sort of addresses this issue maybe on a national or global level. So we raised the search fund and ended up buying Naturade, which is the company that we now own. And our mission and vision is about reversing diet-related illnesses in community of colors, but in really all communities. And we sell like plant-based weight loss shakes and meal replacements and products that'll help you to lose weight in a natural way, kind of like the natural Ozempic, without the side effects. And so it's been a personal thing, which is the reason that we wanted to make a business out of it, because when it's personal, it's easy to be passionate about it. And there's nothing that you should be doing that will consume, most of your day that you're not passionate about. And so being passionate about this is what allowed us to be where we are.
So you're very successful as an entrepreneur. You're in Costco. There's kind of a long story about your progress to get within Costco. But you're in Costco, you're in Target, you've been in Whole Foods. Mm-hmm. And so the really big name, you're on Amazon. So everyone loves to hear about the success. But what about the moments when you thought, this is it, I'm done? Can you give an example of when you thought, I've hit that wall, and the moments before you realized I've got this irrational belief in myself? Mm-hmm. What do you do then?
Yeah, well, my business partner and I call it stand at the edge, staring into the abyss. And we've been at that edge a few times, and that's that's part of the entrepreneurial journey is, it really doesn't start until they've told you no. And you decide that I'm here to win regardless of that no. So I've been there a bunch of times. And so it's one of those things where I'm no longer scared of it. Like the type of thing that would scare most people, I'm just comfortable. I'm comfortable in that discomfort. We've been at the point where, we had a bank that we had a line of credit from, and they decided to call the line, just pay us $2 million next week. And we're like, man, we're not drug dealers, man. We can't just show up with a suitcase full of money. And had to figure out a way to do that. And that meant, being cash flow positive and getting them chunks of money and negotiating and eventually raising a round. And Grant Hill actually saved us in that moment. And even when we tried to raise the search fund, that took a long time. And I remember there was a moment where we broke through in that regard. And that was, one of my investors, and he doesn't like me telling this story, so I'm not gonna say his name. I'm gonna tell the story, but I'm not gonna say his name. Just a major titan on Wall Street, CEO of a major bank. Was the first person that said yes, right? When we were trying to raise a search fund, and we wanted to raise 250 from 4 individuals. And he said, show me that you can raise the rest and then come back to me, and then I'll be the first one to write the check. And so we got the commitments from other important individuals. And we go into his office a year and a half later, and we say, hey, we got the commitment, we're ready for you to write the first check. And then he's there with his advisors, and he's like, do you have like a PPM? Do you have any document? And I said, he'd been had this document, but he wanted it again. So we gave it to him again, and he's thumbing through it, and he goes, what? I'm gonna pay you guys $100,000 each to run this search fund? No, you guys, and he closes the book, he throws it across the table. No, you guys get out of here. You guys come with something else. No, that's not gonna work. And then he gets real Wall Street and starts cursing, right? And I'm saying to myself, man, no grown man has ever cursed to me in my life. Like my mom doesn't even curse. But I was a little bit nervous, I must say. And I said, and in my mind, I was like, well, maybe I'll tell him we'll take $65,000. But I looked at my business partner and I said, well, let's see how he reacts. And he looks at this guy and he goes, I almost told you that name. He goes, guy. He goes, you went to Duke, I went to Duke, Kareem went to Duke. Kareem got his MBA from Duke, I got my MBA from Wharton. Right now, I could go on the street and make $300,000 a year. For $100,000 a year, you get me at a discount, and I'm not gonna take anything less. And he just stared at him. And I was looking at him, looked at the guy, and then he looks at Claude, and finally he goes, all right, what's next? And we go through it, we go through the thing, and we walk out of there with a check, and we have this ritual, my business partner and I, we don't say anything until we get in the car. So we're in the elevator area, quiet, we're on the elevator, it's a quiet ride down. Go out, we get in the car, and I'm like, that's how you drive, Claude, that's how you drive, right? And for me, it was a valuable lesson, right? It was the belief in yourself and knowing your value, and you really have to know who you are and what you're valued at, because no one else will value you, no one else will do it if you don't have that understanding of who you are and what you are before you walk in a room. And so that was an invaluable lesson of no turn yes, first of many.
Okay, so one last thing for me, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. Last time we spoke, your part of your message was be intentional, bold, and confident in what you stand for and who you are. And so that sounds pretty good to me. Mm-hmm. How do you develop that boldness and confidence? Is that something that you can nurture? Are you born with it?
Mm-hmm. On one level, you're born with you all are here because you're confident. I mean, you you wouldn't have shot for Duke if you weren't confident. But I think that it can take some, you could always be working on yourself and your confidence. And the way you do that is just to actually be confident, be great at what you do. But you have to have that belief. And I think that that it's something that can be developed, but it's really something that is who you are, right? And for me, I've just never been afraid to be in a room and say what needs to be said, and it's manifested itself in just wonderful ways in my life. And I started to tell you that Costco story. I'll finish it by saying, we ended up having this meeting with the CEO of Costco, and at that meeting, he's like, I want more diversity in Costco. I want more diversity, minority and women-owned businesses here, not just vendors, but in the C-suite. And I interrupted and I said, listen, and this was a very bold thing to do because this could have got me kicked out immediately. And I said, look, you sound like a great person, but what you guys practice here is what we call systemic bias, right? And of course, he was a little embarrassed, and he was like, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, you have a mandate that you don't want to be more than 20% of a company's revenue. However, the average SKU in all eight regions does $50 million. So how many black-owned companies do you think there are out there that do 200 to 250 million in sales that can qualify to be in Costco? Like zero. You will never have a black-owned company here. And it's your own mandate. It's the people in this room that are preventing that from happening. People who just said they want that. And so he said, well, what if we give you 5 stores? That was his initial reaction. I said, well, give us 5 stores. We'll put Magic Johnson on the radio in LA and we'll go from there. Happy to start there. Next morning we had 40 stores, and by right now we have 114 stores. We worked our way to that point. The next thing he said was, well, now that you kind of embarrassed me, you said what you had to say, what else am I missing? Maybe I'm missing something else. So, well, Costco does $220 billion, and my business partner said this because he might be watching the video, so I can't take credit for what he said. He said, Costco does $220 billion in revenue. Some of that, it's good CFOs reinvesting in, but some of it just having a savings account somewhere and making 1 or 2%. You ever thought about putting some of that in a black-owned bank? And he said, no, do you know any? I said, yeah, we actually do. And 3 weeks later, they put $25 million with LISC that disseminated to black banks. And then finally, he said, now I'm interested in you and your journey, because he understands that the Costco CEO office is the most significant office in retail in the world. How did you journey through life to get into my office? And I said, well, there was a program I was in called Prep for Prep. And he said, well, we're going to do something we've never done in the history of Costco. Half the profits from the proceeds of the sales of your products, we're going to donate to the inner city education programs of your choice. And last December, they wrote a check for $197,000 each to both programs, which was the biggest alumni-generated donation that Prep for Prep has ever received. So very proud of that moment, but it was about being confident and saying and doing the right thing to do in the moment while you're in that room and you're in a place and you have the opportunity to do something. And so I would encourage you all to work on that if you don't have that naturally, but just be bold and be fearless, because that's why you're here, so that you can be fearless, because when it's time to fight, you're prepared. You spent 2 years here being baptized by fire, and I know what that's like. I spent enough nights in that team room for that financial accounting exam on Friday, a test every Friday, quiz every Friday. You guys are doing the hardest thing you'll ever do in life right now. So everything else is easy. It's just about being confident enough to know that no matter what somebody presents to you, you're prepared for it. So. Okay,
well, that's a wonderful example of making your business better while doing something that's good for society. So with that, questions?
You identified a few qualities as being key to your personal success. So being comfortable in the discomfort, boldness, fearlessness. Do you think those are things that a person can work on if they don't have and cultivate within themselves? Or is it something that you're sort of born with as part of your character and can only improve if you already have it?
It is absolutely something that you can develop and work on. Absolutely. Because I've known plenty of people who actually purposely put themselves in uncomfortable positions so that they could feel the worst possible outcome of that, right? So, my dad always said something like the fear of falling, no, the fear of flying, you overcome the fear of flying by overcoming the fear of falling, right? And so once you realize that failing is not that big of a deal, then you allow yourself to take risks with the things you're uncomfortable with. You understand? Does that make sense to you? And so, I took a public speaking class, not because I'm not confident, because, I've had some insecurities about, growing up in the Bronx and some of my leftover Ebonics and, being in the, I don't know if everybody knows what that means, but anyway, I'm rough around the edges, right? And I used to be insecure about that. And I realized, that's nothing to be insecure about, because what I bring to the table is a very unique set of skills, a very unique set of competencies that I should never be ashamed of, and after that, I wasn't afraid of public speaking, but it took me taking that class and then speaking to a whole bunch of people and everyone thinks that, for a while, people think that because, I'm the life of the party that, entertaining a bunch of friends is different than speaking to a room full of 300, 400 people. And that was something I had to overcome personally, right? And so you could definitely do it. I mean, these are all skills you can develop and work on yourself for sure.
Kareem, my name is Jonathan, one of the co-founders and president of our new ETA club here, and so very happy to see that you were one of our early vanguard entrepreneurs sort of spearheading this. And while I have a ton of questions about that, I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on, as you framed it, the inflection points that come into our progression ourselves. And I think, speaking for myself and maybe many of our peers, some of us are at that inflection point now where we're evaluating future offers or considering the path of our career post-MBA, and I'm wondering if you might have any thoughts about how to navigate the inflection point of whether or not we consider ourselves to pursue an entrepreneurial path.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is it's really a different answer for each individual, right? For me, my mentality was, and I have a mentor, Owen May, who's the first African-American to graduate from the business school once it was called Fuqua, so we said the godfather of Fuqua. He has a saying, he has a thing that he'd always say about, it's like being a captain of being the general of a group of troops, and you take your troops to some island and you let everybody get off the boat, and then you blow up the boat, right? You're either going to die on the island or you're going to conquer it, but going back is not an option. And that was how I saw it, right? There are other people who like to hedge, and I've seen people win in that regard as well. I have a classmate who's very successful, same thing, entrepreneur, but he was married, right? He couldn't live his wife wasn't trying to live in a futon in the dance academy somewhere, driving around in a 14-foot renovated U-Haul truck going out to dinner. So,
What was the bill when you returned that U-Haul truck, by the way?
Oh man, that was. I have a picture of it. I just posted that on Facebook actually. But so it's different for every person, and I wouldn't suggest what I did for everyone. You just have to decide. But there will come a point where, this is it. Like I have to jump or go back, one or the other, right? And you can't dance along that line forever, because you won't do anything well if you don't go in a direction and go hard eventually, right? The question that I would say is, what I would tell you is that you just need to be prepared for that moment, right? So you might take a great job and have this on the horizon, know that 4 years from now, I want to own my own thing. And so you will spend differently, right? Okay, well, guess what? We're gonna be in a 1-bedroom apartment, and I'm gonna stack, $400,000 to the side so that I can take a risk. I can bet on myself with that money in 4 years, something like that. Whereas, I just dove in right after business school. I just said no to the Disney offer, and then decided I was gonna, I didn't want the golden handcuffs. I didn't want it to be hard for me to say, this is too much money to give up. I just chose from the beginning. But it's different for each person, and I've seen people be successful, both those different ways. By the way, I'm gonna come and spend some time with your class, and you guys we can talk. We're gonna set that up for some time this year.
So obviously meeting with someone like the CEO of Costco, even before that, the CFO, what are some of the things that you did to prepare, knowing that you'd be kind of maybe throwing all different types of questions, and you're kind of in the presence of executive major corporation? Like what did that preparation process look like for you and your partner? Right.
And so it's really easy to talk about yourself or to write about yourself. What's really hard is to convince somebody that what I am and who I am and what I bring to the table benefits you, right? So that's the challenge. Why should Costco take me? If you're taking $50 million a year company, you're taking these billion-dollar corporations, why should you take us? And so that was, because that's ultimately the answer. What benefit does it have to you as a company, not as an individual, because we know you're a good guy. I could just donate to you. And so that's the answer that you have to solve before you walk into any room, right? What value am I bringing to this relationship, all relationships? And so I think that is the answer, and that's going to be different depending on what the situation. But for us, and I'll answer that question, I don't know if you're asking specifically about Costco, it's like, look, you need more diversity. And more importantly than that, because that's debatable, right? I believe it, but not everybody believes it. And so you don't have to believe what I believe. But what I will convince you of is that there is a hole in your set that my product fills, that hole. We're uniquely qualified to fill a demand that's being unmet in Costco. And for us, it was, you have weight loss, you have plant-based, if I want to lose weight, then you have this milk-based product and I'm lactose intolerant, or I don't do it for whatever reason, or I don't want 40 grams of sugar, then you don't have a product that satisfies me, right? After, that customer, and we did the research, that customer will buy a weight loss pill or whatever from somewhere else, from Whole Foods. And then they will buy a plant-based product from some natural store. You don't have this product. And we convinced them just the business case. All that other stuff is debatable. But what was not debatable was that you don't have anything in your set that does this, and there's demand for it. And we could show them the numbers. And so I think that's what you need to, whenever you walk into any situation, any relationship, this is what I bring to the table. This is why you need what I bring to the table.
So slightly different when you're raising capital. What was your pitch to Magic Johnson to get him? He's a very high-profile investor.
Yeah. So Magic Johnson, it was one. He liked the product. It's funny. I pitched Magic Johnson a couple of different times, and so it took about 5 years from the moment I met him to the moment he agreed to do something. And I was introduced to him originally by a former distinguished speaker here in the series, and who I met the day of. I met him the day of and established a relationship, and eventually invested in me multiple times. And he was also Magic Johnson's advisor. So he was already an investor in the company. And he's the one that convinced Magic Johnson to sell his 125 Starbucks franchises and invest with him to buy the Dodgers, which he eventually did. So that was meeting one. Meeting two was when Zion Williamson and those guys went to the Elite Eight and lost to Michigan State. Magic was there, and Grant Hill and I walked over, and that's when I made the pitch, right? Like, all right, you beat us. Now we need you to join our team, And so it was, for Magic, he invests because it makes business sense. He liked me, I guess, but it made business sense for what he was trying to do. And in specific, he has a partnership with Sodexo called Sodexo Magic. And he thought that Black colleges and hospitals in urban areas could use products like ours. And so it made sense for him and his business endeavors, which is why he wanted to do it, you know. And he felt bad for beating us in the Elite Eight.
As he should, yes.
My question is, when you speak about the grind and pushing and working for 2, 3, 5 years to bring something to life like your businesses, how do you balance and think about balancing the pushing and the grind against picking your head up and making sure that you're pushing in the right direction?
Yeah. So you should always be, and I wouldn't say that we physically do this, but you should always be writing and editing your business plan, right? And measuring where you are versus where you said you would be at this point. And that's key because, you could turn around and be nowhere near where you said you would be, or even why you're doing what you're doing. So you always need to check your temperature. But for me, I have a business partner. And it's almost like, I made this reference that wasn't always well received, but there's this famous poem called Footprints, where like the guy's walking on a beach and he looks back over his life and sometimes he sees 2 sets of footprints, sometimes he sees one. And he's talking to God and he says, well, why did you leave me during these moments? Whereas one set, and he's like, my child, those were the moments I was carrying. And so, when you have a business partner and you have a team, then sometimes you're walking together, and sometimes that person is carrying you, and sometimes you're carrying that person. And so, and that's been the best decision that I've ever made, was picking the right business partner, so that we could we fight a lot. we fight, literally, we fought in the office. Oh my God. Yeah, so, but we're brothers, we've been through this thing together, and we're forged, we're together. And so even when we disagree, we respect each other enough to listen to how could you see it differently? And I have to sit there and listen because I respect your view, and you've been right other times when I've been wrong. And so, you need somebody to bounce these things off of you. And so I would say, some people take the entrepreneurial route by themselves. For me, thank God I had a business partner. Yeah.
Yeah. Time for one last question. In the back, yeah.
Thank you. Hello, thank you so much for all the gems you've been dropping first. My name is Nia Cross, and I'm an undergraduate junior majoring in journalism and African American studies. And I'm curious to know what you read, consume, and or listen to on a daily basis to help propel you forward as an entrepreneur.
It's a good question. What do I consume? So I do go to church, so I consume the word. But I listen to a lot of different things because I just hate that I have to give you the honest answer here. Oh man, so I like to stay up on what's happening in the world, right? Just because I consider myself a global citizen, and it's important to me what's happening in the world. So I try to listen to different news streams, right, to get different perspectives and understand what's going on. Once I feel like I have that, I don't dive too much into that. I listen to a lot of hip hop news, right, because people hate me for this, but I listen to there's a guy named Vlad who does Vlad TV, and he interviews hip hop artists, but he interviews a lot of political people as well. And for me, it's not that I think this guy's smart or anything, but I like to be kept abreast of what's going on in pop culture, because ultimately I need to be able to communicate to people who are in pop culture, in the hip hop community, because those are the people who are setting the trends for what's happening. And so I need to know what's going on there, and I don't want to listen to Lil Uzi Vert, or I just want to know who he is and what he's doing and why he's significant. You know what I mean? And so that's important to me. I listen to what are those guys' name? Very Smart Brothers, right? I'm listening to just to understand what's going on in the business world from like a Black culture, African American perspective. But I'm also reading the New York Times and sometimes the Wall Street Journal. Not that I read it too much, but so I try to get information from a whole bunch of different sources, just so I can be well-rounded enough, so that whenever I'm in a conversation, whenever I'm in a room, no matter what the conversation is, I have something to contribute, right? And even if I don't have anything to contribute, I'm equipped and qualified to at least understand what's being said, right? So I can understand why people feel a certain way. And like I said, I tend to be open-minded, and I feel like there's value in a world where we're highly political, highly politicized, and and people see things as good and evil and right and wrong. I'm a person who understands that most of us are in the middle, and so I try to understand the good people on both sides, and try. And it's served me. Listen, it has served me in such a beneficial way to just be open-minded and try to understand why people have certain perspectives and not judge people, not make people feel like they can't talk to me about who they really are, because it's allowed me to connect with people who I disagree with on various topics, but they still have value, and we still respect each other enough to help each other in the business world. So.
Okay, well, Kareem, thank you so much on behalf of the Fuqua community for sharing your wisdom with us and for being an incredible role model in terms of your authenticity, your generosity, and your decency. Thank you so much.
Thank you.